In a quiet courtroom nestled within a mid-sized southern town, the echoes of the past seemed to hum softly in the background. The large wooden benches, worn down from years of wear, creaked under the weight of those who sat nervously, waiting their turn before the bench. The room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood, and a large American flag hung behind the judge's seat, its presence commanding respect. Judge William Carrington was known for his no-nonsense demeanor. A man in his mid-50s with sharp features and a gaze that could cut through steel, he prided himself on upholding the law without bias. His courtroom was his domain, and in it he was the unquestioned authority. He sat high above the proceedings, tapping his pen thoughtfully as the next case was called. Next case, Elizabeth Wright, the clerk announced, her voice echoing through the chamber. All eyes turned to the back of the room as a woman rose from one of the rear benches. Elizabeth Wright walked with an air of quiet confidence, her stride steady but unhurried. She was a striking figure, dressed simply but elegantly, in a tailored suit that spoke to her professionalism and self-assurance. Her hair, pulled back into a neat bun, framed a face that seemed calm, composed, and unbothered by the murmurs that followed her entry. Judge Carrington glanced briefly at the docket. Asterisk, asterisk, minimum traffic violation. Asterisk, asterisk, he noted to himself. A routine case, nothing out of the ordinary. But something about the woman standing before him felt different, though he couldn't quite place it. Elizabeth stood at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She made no effort to explain herself right away, simply waiting for the proceedings to begin. Carrington cleared his throat. Ms. Wright, you've been cited for a parking violation in a restricted zone. How do you plead? Guilty, Your Honor, Elizabeth replied, her voice even respectful. However, I would like to explain the circumstances. The judge raised an eyebrow. Explanations rarely changed the outcome in his courtroom. Rules were rules, and he wasn't known for bending them. Proceed, he said, leaning back slightly in his chair, arms crossed. Elizabeth took a small step forward. I was attending a conference of the university, she began, her tone measured. The parking signs were not clearly visible due to construction in the area. I tried to find alternative parking, but time constraints made it difficult. I made the best decision I could in the moment. Carrington gave a small nod, but his expression remained impassive. While I appreciate your explanation, Ms. Wright, the law is the law. Ignorance of the signs is not an excuse. There was a rustle in the gallery, a mixture of discomfort and quiet judgment. Elizabeth's face remained composed, though a flicker of something unreadable crossed her eyes. I understand, Your Honor, she said, offering a slight nod of acknowledgement. The judge glanced at her again, his eyes narrowing slightly. He wasn't sure why, but something about her seemed oddly familiar. Asterisk, asterisko, visiting professor, asterisk, asterisk, he wondered. Perhaps he'd seen her name in some academic publication or in connection with the conference. Very well, he said at last. The fine stands. $150, payable within 30 days. Elizabeth nodded, reaching for her purse. But before she could pull out her checkbook, a voice from the gallery called out. Wait a minute. The room fell silent as a man, dressed in a smart blazer and jeans, stood up from the back row. He appeared slightly out of place, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Your Honor, if I may, he said, clearing his throat, you should know who this woman is before you finalize your judgment. Carrington frowned. He didn't appreciate interruptions, especially not from the gallery. And who, exactly, is she? He asked, his voice laced with impatience. She's a visiting scholar, the man blurted out, from Oxford. She's not just here for some conference. She's part of an academic exchange program between our university and one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. The room collectively inhaled, a murmur of surprise rippling through the crowd. Elizabeth's expression remained calm, though her eyes softened slightly as she turned to acknowledge the man who had spoken up. Judge Carrington's eyes narrowed further. Asterisk, asterisk, Oxford. Asterisk, asterisk. He looked back at Elizabeth, scrutinizing her more closely. The confident demeanor, the precise articulation. It all made sense now. And suddenly, this wasn't just another minor case. The stakes felt different, though he couldn't quite articulate why. Elizabeth met his gaze without flinching. There was no arrogance in her posture, only a quiet dignity. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I only wanted to provide context." Carrington felt a strange knot forming in his stomach, a mixture of embarrassment and defensiveness. He prided himself on being fair and impartial, but he also knew how easily public perception could shift. And now, with the room watching him closely, he felt the weight of his own judgment pressing down. "You may be from Oxford," he said slowly, "but in this courtroom, everyone is equal under the law." Elizabeth nodded again. "Of course, Your Honor. I wouldn't expect anything else." The tension in the room was palpable. Carrington tapped his pen again, the sound echoing like a gavel strike. He wasn't sure how to proceed. Should he reconsider? Would it appear weak? Before he could decide, the courtroom door swung open, and a young woman in a crisp suit entered, carrying a stack of papers. She approached the bench and whispered something in the judge's ear. Whatever she said made Carrington's face tighten. He cleared his throat once more, turning back to Elizabeth. "Ms. Wright," he began, "it seems there may be additional information pertinent to your case." And with that, the courtroom collectively leaned forward, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. What had just been revealed, and how it would change everything. The story was far from over. Elizabeth's eyes flicked toward the young woman who had just whispered into Judge Carrington's ear. There was no visible sign of distress on Elizabeth's face, but an undeniable curiosity gleamed in her eyes. The courtroom, though hushed, felt charged, like the air before a summer storm. Every gaze was locked on the judge, waiting for his next move. Judge Carrington shifted in his chair. His earlier certainty had been replaced with something else: hesitation, perhaps even a twinge of regret. He carefully examined the papers in front of him, his brow furrowing deeper with each line he read. A heavy silence hung over the room, broken only by the faint scratching of his pen against paper. "Ms. Wright," he said finally, his voice measured but tinged with a hint of unease. "I have just been informed that your contributions to the academic community extend beyond the realm of this conference. Is that correct?" Elizabeth inclined her head slightly. "Yes, Your Honor. I specialize in social justice research and legal reform. My work focuses on systemic inequities in judicial systems, particularly those that disproportionately affect marginalized communities." A murmur rippled through the room. The significance of her words wasn't lost on anyone. This wasn't just about a parking ticket anymore. It was about something far bigger. The irony of the situation was impossible to ignore. A scholar studying justice now standing before a judge, accused of breaking the law. Carrington's eyes darkened. He knew the spotlight was now firmly on him, and whatever decision he made would be scrutinized, dissected, and possibly even publicized. The media love stories like this, stories that blur the line between irony and injustice. Elizabeth continued, her voice steady, but not without emotion. "I've spent years researching cases where minor infractions escalate into life-altering events for individuals, often because of socioeconomic barriers. I never imagined I'd find myself on the other side of that dynamic." The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. The audience, once restless, now sat motionless, hanging on her every word. Even Carrington seemed momentarily disarmed, caught between his duty to uphold the law and the broader implications of what was unfolding. The man in the blazer, still standing awkwardly at the back of the courtroom, cleared his throat again, drawing attention back to himself. "Your Honor, if I may add," he began, glancing nervously at Elizabeth for permission before continuing, "Ms. Wright's work has directly influenced policy changes in several countries. She's not just an academic, she's a catalyst for change." Elizabeth shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the praise, but too polite to interrupt. Carrington, however, was less impressed by the interruption. "Mr. Sanders," the judge said, addressing the man by name for the first time, "while I appreciate your enthusiasm, this court does not operate on accolades or reputation. We deal in facts and the rule of law." Sanders nodded quickly, retreating back into his seat, but the tension in the room remained thick. Elizabeth's gaze never wavered from the judge's, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere. Carrington sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He glanced again at the papers in front of him. Papers that now felt heavier than they should have. There was something in them, some detail that complicated matters further, that he wasn't ready to reveal it yet. "Ms. Wright," he said, his tone softening slightly, "you mentioned systemic inequities. Are you implying that this court, my court, is part of that system?" Elizabeth hesitated. It was a loaded question, and the wrong answer could tip the scales against her. But she was not one to shy away from the truth. "I'm saying that no system is immune, Your Honor," she replied carefully. "And it's only through acknowledging that fact that we can begin to make meaningful changes." Carrington leaned back in his chair, considering her words. The room was so silent now that the faint ticking of the courtroom clock seemed deafening. He was no stranger to criticism, judges rarely were. But this felt different, more personal somehow. As he deliberated, a soft knock came from the side door leading to his chambers. A bailiff approached, whispering something that made Carrington's expression tighten further. Whatever was happening behind the scenes was clearly escalating, though only he seemed privy to the details. "I need a moment," Carrington announced abruptly. "Court is in recess for 15 minutes. The gavel struck, and the room erupted into whispers as people began to speculate. Elizabeth remained at her spot, watching the judge retreat to his chambers. Sanders approached her cautiously. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. Elizabeth nodded. "I've been in tougher situations, but thank you, David. I didn't expect you to speak up like that." David Sanders smiled sheepishly. "Well, someone had to. You've done too much for too many people to be treated like just another case file." Elizabeth offered a small, grateful smile, but didn't respond. Her mind was elsewhere, turning over the events of the past few minutes. Something about the judge's behavior nagged at her. He wasn't just being difficult, he was grappling with something deeper. The courtroom slowly began to empty as people filed out for the recess, but Elizabeth remained seated, lost in thought. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than a parking ticket. There was a puzzle here, pieces scattered and waiting to be put together. When the 15 minutes were up, the courtroom filled once more, the buzz of anticipation even stronger than before. Judge Carrington re-entered, his face a mask of professionalism, but Elizabeth noticed the subtle shift in his demeanor. He seemed wary. "Ms. Wright," he began, his voice steady, but lacking its earlier edge, "I've reviewed additional information pertinent to your case. It appears there was indeed confusion regarding the signage due to ongoing construction." Elizabeth's brow furrowed slightly. This was a significant concession, but it felt incomplete, as if there was more he wasn't saying. "Given these circumstances," Carrington continued, "I am inclined to reduce the fine to a nominal fee pending administrative approval." A collective gasp rippled through the room. This was unexpected, an olive branch from a man not known for giving them. Elizabeth met his gaze, searching for the hidden motive behind the sudden shift. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice measured. "I appreciate the court's reconsideration." Carrington nodded curtly, tapping his gavel once more. Court adjourned. The room erupted into whispers again, but Elizabeth remained still, watching as the judge gathered his papers and disappeared into his chambers. There were questions left unanswered, tensions unresolved, and as she walked out of the courtroom, she knew this was far from over. Elizabeth stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp afternoon air, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. The reduced fine was a small victory, but the abrupt shift in Judge Carrington's demeanor left her uneasy. Something had changed behind the scenes, something significant. She could feel it in the way he had spoken, the hesitation in his voice, the way he avoided meeting her eyes as the gavel fell. David Sanders walked beside her, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his blazer. "Well, that was intense," he said, breaking the silence. Elizabeth nodded but didn't respond immediately. Her eyes scanned the bustling street, taking in the scene without really seeing it. Pedestrians moved with purpose, cars honked in the distance, and the world carried on as if nothing had happened. But for Elizabeth, the weight of the courtroom still lingered. "Do you think he knew who you were before today?" David asked, his voice quieter now, as if the question itself carried a kind of danger. Elizabeth shook her head. "I don't think so. If he did, he didn't let on. But something changed in there. That wasn't just about a parking ticket." David frowned. "Do you think someone tipped him off? Maybe about your research?" "Maybe," Elizabeth said, her mind racing through the possibilities. "But why would that matter? Judges deal with academics all the time. My work isn't exactly revolutionary. It's just data and analysis." David gave her a look. "You're being modest. You've exposed flaws in the justice system that make a lot of people uncomfortable. Maybe someone doesn't like the idea of you digging around here." Elizabeth sighed, the weight of his words settling on her shoulders. It wasn't the first time her research had drawn scrutiny. In the past, she'd received thinly veiled threats, anonymous emails warning her to stay in her lane. But she had always brushed them off, focusing on the bigger picture. This felt different, though. More immediate, more personal. They reached the steps of the courthouse, where a small crowd had gathered. Reporters, cameras in hand, shouted questions, their voices blending into a chaotic blur. "Dr. Wright, can we get a comment on today's proceedings? Do you believe the judge's decision was influenced by your work on judicial bias? Are you planning to challenge a fine?" Elizabeth raised her hand, signaling for quiet. "I appreciate your interest," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I have no further comments at this time." The reporters pressed in, but David stepped forward, guiding her through the crowd. They made their way to a waiting car, the driver holding the door open with a practiced efficiency. Once inside, the noise faded, replaced by the soft hum of the engine. Elizabeth leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The day had taken a toll on her, and the weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on her chest. She felt David's gaze on her, but didn't open her eyes. "What now?" he asked quietly. Elizabeth opened her eyes, staring out the window as the city blurred past. "Now I find out what's really going on." Back at her hotel, Elizabeth sat at the small desk, her laptop open in front of her. The glow of the screen illuminated her face as she typed, searching for any information that might explain Judge Carrington's sudden change of heart. She combed through legal databases, news articles, and academic journals, but nothing stood out. Carrington was known for being tough but fair, a stickler for the rules. There were no scandals, no controversies, just a long career marked by quiet diligence. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. Frowning, she crossed the room and opened the door a crack. "David?" she asked, surprised to see him standing there, looking unusually tense. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. Elizabeth stepped aside, letting him in. He paced the room, running a hand through his hair. "I did some digging," he said, not waiting for her to ask. "There's more to Carrington than what's on the surface." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Go on." David took a deep breath. A few years ago, he presided over a case involving a prominent developer, someone with deep pockets and powerful connections. The case was complicated. Let's just say the outcome was favorable to the developer, and there were whispers about backroom deals. Nothing was ever proven, but it raised eyebrows. Elizabeth leaned against the desk, processing the information. "And you think this has something to do with today?" "I don't know," David admitted. "But if Carrington has skeletons in his closet, it might explain why he's so jittery. Maybe someone's using that against him." Elizabeth considered this, her mind racing. It was a plausible theory, but it still didn't answer the most pressing question. Why her? What did her case have to do with any of it? "There's something else," David said, breaking into her thoughts. I got a call from a friend at the university. Apparently, someone's been asking questions about you, your background, your work. It's not just curiosity. They're digging. Elizabeth's stomach tightened. Who? David shook his head. I don't know, but whoever it is, they're thorough. This isn't just a passing interest. Elizabeth took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The walls were closing in, and the sense of unease she felt all day was now a full-blown alarm. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being pulled into something much larger than a parking ticket. What do we do? David asked, his voice tinged with concern. Elizabeth straightened, her resolve hardening. We keep digging. If someone's coming after me, I need to know why. And if Carrington's involved, we need to find out how. David nodded, his expression serious. I'm with you. As the night stretched on, the two of them pored over documents, making calls and connecting dots that refused to form a clear picture. The truth was out there, lurking just beyond their grasp. And as Elizabeth stared at the lines of text on her screen, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The sun was barely rising when Elizabeth shut her laptop and leaned back in her chair, exhaustion pulling at her. David had fallen asleep on the small couch, his head resting awkwardly on a throw pillow, but Elizabeth couldn't stop. Her mind was a storm of unanswered questions and half-formed theories. Somewhere in the tangled web of information they'd uncovered, the truth was waiting. She just hadn't found it yet. She stood, stretching her stiff limbs, and walked over to the window. The city below was waking up, bathed in the soft light of dawn. For a moment, everything looked peaceful, ordinary. But Elizabeth knew better. Beneath the surface, things were shifting, aligning in ways she couldn't fully understand yet. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. The number was unknown, but something told her to answer. Hello. A voice, low and controlled, spoke on the other end. Dr. Wright, I believe you're looking for answers. Elizabeth's grip tightened on the phone. Who is this? That's not important. What matters is that you're in the middle of something you don't fully understand. Carrington isn't your real problem. Elizabeth's heart raced. Then who is? The line went silent for a moment, the kind of pause that felt deliberate. Meet me at the park on Elm Street. 10 o'clock. Come alone. The call ended before she could respond. Elizabeth stared at the phone, her mind spinning. Every instinct told her this was dangerous, but it also felt like the only way forward. Whoever that was, they knew something crucial. David stared on the couch, blinking up at her groggily. What time is it? Almost 7, Elizabeth replied, slipping her phone into her pocket. I need to go out for a bit. David sat up, rubbing his eyes. What? Where? We've barely slept. I got a call, Elizabeth said, grabbing her coat. Someone wants to meet. They have information. David was fully awake now, his expression shifting to concern. Are you serious? And you're just going to trust them? I don't trust anyone right now, Elizabeth admitted. But I can't ignore this. If they know something about Carrington, or about why I'm being targeted, I need to find out. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. At least let me come with you. They said to come alone, Elizabeth said firmly. I'll be careful, I promise. David didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue further. Just call me if anything feels off. I will, Elizabeth assured him. And with that, she was at the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The park on Elm Street was quiet, the kind of place that felt frozen in time. A few joggers passed by, and an older couple sat on a bench feeding pigeons. Elizabeth scanned the area, looking for anything or anyone out of place. A man in a dark coat stood near a fountain, his back to her. As she approached, he turned, revealing a face that was both unfamiliar and oddly familiar at the same time. His features were sharp, his eyes cold but calculating. Dr. Wright, he said, his voice the same one from the call. Thank you for coming. Who are you? Elizabeth asked, keeping her distance. A friend, he replied, though there was nothing friendly about him. Let's just say I have a vested interest in what happens next. Elizabeth folded her arms, her eyes narrowing. And what exactly is happening? The man glanced around, making sure they weren't being watched. Carrington is a pawn. He's being leveraged by people far more powerful than you realize. People who don't appreciate your insights. My research? Elizabeth asked, her mind racing. The man nodded. Your work shines a light on things they'd rather keep in the dark. And now that you're here, in their backyard, they see you as a threat. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. Who are they? That's not a question you want answered, the man said, his tone warning. But you need to understand something. This isn't just about you. It's about control. Influence. Carrington is caught in their web. And now so are you. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. I'm not going to back down. I figured you'd say that, the man said, a hint of admiration in his voice. But be careful. They're watching your every move. One wrong step, and they won't hesitate to make an example out of you. Elizabeth's mind raced with possibilities. Every piece of information she gathered suddenly felt more urgent, more dangerous. Why are you telling me this? The man's expression softened, just for a moment. Let's just say I have my reasons. Keep your head down, Dr. Wright, and watch your back. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Elizabeth stood there, the weight of his words pressing down on her. The stakes had just been raised, and the game she was playing was far more dangerous than she had realized. Her phone buzzed again. A text from David. Asterisk, asterisk everything, okay, asterisk, asterisk. Elizabeth took a deep breath and typed back. Asterisk, asterisk, not sure. But I'll explain soon, asterisk, asterisk. As she walked back to the hotel, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She needed to act, to piece together the puzzle before it was too late. But one thing was certain. This was far from over, and the real battle was just beginning. Elizabeth's heart pounded as she pushed open the door to her hotel room. David looked up from the desk, concern etched into every line of his face. Before he could speak, she held up a hand, signaling the urgency of what she had just learned. Something's bigger at play, she said, closing the door firmly behind her. Carrington is just a small piece. There's a group, powerful people, who see me as a threat. David's eyes widened. A group? What kind of group? And why would they care about your research? Elizabeth sank into the chair across from him, rubbing her temples. It's not just the research. It's what it exposes. Systemic flaws, corruption, the kind of things they can't afford to have the public scrutinize. I don't know who they are yet, but they've got influence. Enough to manipulate someone like Carrington. David let out a low whistle. That's serious. Do you think this has anything to do with that old case? The one where Carrington ruled in favor of the developer? Maybe, Elizabeth said, though uncertainty weighed heavy in her voice. The man I met at the park hinted at it, but he didn't give me any names. David leaned back, running a hand through his hair. So, what's the next move? Before Elizabeth could answer, her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Her stomach tightened as she debated whether to answer. Against her better judgment, she swiped to accept the call. Dr. Wright, a different voice said this time, calm, measured, and chillingly detached. You've been asking the wrong questions. Elizabeth's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? You're standing on the edge of something you can't control, the voice continued, ignoring her question. Walk away while you still can. Elizabeth felt a surge of defiance. I'm not going anywhere. A cold silence followed. Then the voice delivered a chilling statement. Your career, your reputation, your freedom, they're all at risk. Think carefully, Dr. Wright. The call ended abruptly, leaving Elizabeth staring at the phone, her mind racing. David was already on his feet, his face pale. What was that about? Elizabeth set the phone down slowly. A warning. David swore under his breath. This is getting out of hand. We need help. Someone who can protect you. Elizabeth shook her head. I can't trust anyone right now. Not until I know who's behind this. David paced the room, clearly frustrated. You can't do this alone, Elizabeth. If they're as powerful as you say, they'll bury you. I'm not alone, she said quietly, meeting his gaze. I have you. David stopped pacing, his expression softening. Yeah, you do. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Then, as if on cue, Elizabeth's laptop chimed. A notification from one of the databases she had set to alert her of updates related to Carrington. She opened it, her eyes scanning the screen. What is it? David asked, leaning over her shoulder. Elizabeth's heart raced as she read. There's a sealed file tied to Carrington's name. It's linked to a non-disclosure agreement from that old case. If we can access it. David frowned. That's risky. You'd need a court order or a hacker. Elizabeth's mind raced. I know someone. A journalist I worked with a few years ago. She might be able to help. David nodded. Then let's call her. But Elizabeth, if we do this, there's no turning back. Elizabeth met his gaze, her determination clear. I wasn't planning on turning back. Later that night, they met with Claire, the journalist, in a dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of town. Claire was sharp, with eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for uncovering stories others wouldn't dare touch. This is dangerous, Claire warned as Elizabeth explained the situation. If they've gone to these lengths to keep it quiet, they won't hesitate to come after you. I know, Elizabeth said, but the truth matters. Claire studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, I'll see what I can find. But be ready, this could open a floodgate. As they left the cafe, Elizabeth felt a mix of hope and dread. They were closer to the truth, but the stakes were higher than ever. And as they walked back to the car, a shadow moved across the street, a silent reminder that someone was always watching. 2 days later, Claire called Elizabeth with an urgency that left no room for delay. I've got something. Meet me at my office. Now. Her voice crackled through the line, the weight of her discovery hanging between them. Elizabeth and David didn't waste time. They grabbed their coats and hurried out, their nerves stretched thin. Claire's office was cluttered with papers and photos pinned to the walls, each one telling a story of corruption and power. She closed the door behind them and locked it, a grim look on her face. I managed to crack into that sealed file, she began, pulling up a series of documents on her computer. And you're not going to believe what's in it. Elizabeth leaned in, her eyes scanning the screen. What she saw made her blood run cold. The documents revealed a network of bribes and backdoor deals involving not just Carrington, but several high-profile officials. The old case with the developer was just the tip of the iceberg. The same shadowy group had been pulling strings for years, manipulating cases and silencing anyone who got too close. They call themselves the Concord Group, Claire explained. They operate in the shadows, using people like Carrington to maintain control. And here's the kicker. They've been monitoring you for months. Elizabeth's heart pounded as the pieces fell into place. Her research, her presence in the courtroom, even the parking ticket. It had all been orchestrated to intimidate her. They wanted to send a message, she whispered. Claire nodded. Exactly, but there's more. Carrington wasn't just scared of them. He was trying to protect someone. His daughter. She's a whistleblower in a separate case, and the Concord Group threatened her life. Elizabeth sat back, overwhelmed. It all made sense now. Carrington's sudden change of heart, the warring phone calls, it wasn't just about her. It was about saving his family. We have to expose this, she said, determination hardening in her voice. Claire hesitated. Exposing them will put a target on your back. Are you sure? I don't have a choice, Elizabeth replied. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone they've silenced. David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We're with you. The next few days were a blur of planning and strategizing. Claire reached out to trusted contacts in the media, while Elizabeth prepared a detailed report backed by the incriminating documents. they decided to hold a press conference, making the information public in one fell swoop. If the Concord Group wanted to keep things quiet, they would now have to contend with a very loud public outcry. On the morning of the press conference, the tension was palpable. Elizabeth stood behind the podium, the room filled with journalists, cameras flashing as they waited her statement. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and began. "What you're about to hear is a story of corruption and abuse of power," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But it's also a story of courage, of people who refuse to be silenced." She laid out the evidence piece by piece, exposing the Concord Group's influence and Carrington's role. She also made it clear that Carrington had acted out of fear for his daughter, painting a picture of a man caught in an impossible situation. As she spoke, the room buzzed with a mix of shock and outrage. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. After the press conference, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of calm. The weight she had been carrying for weeks had finally lifted. But as she and David walked back to their car, a black SUV pulled up beside them. Two men in suits stepped out, their faces unreadable. "Dr. Wright," one of them said, "we need to talk." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. "Who are you?" "FBI," the man replied, holding up a badge. "We've been investigating the Concord Group for years. Thanks to your evidence, we finally have what we need to take them down." Elizabeth exchanged a look with David, relief flooding her system. But just as she was about to breathe easy, the agent added, "There's one more thing. Carrington didn't make it to his daughter. We think the group got to him first." The news hit Elizabeth like a punch to the gut. She had exposed the truth, but the cost had been high. Still, she knew this fight wasn't over. The Concord Group was powerful, but now they were exposed. And Elizabeth wasn't about to back down. As she watched the agents drive away, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle was far from won, but for the first time in weeks, she felt hope. Together, she, David, and Claire would continue to shine a light in the darkness, ensuring that justice, no matter how elusive, would always have its champions.